The sun bled red across the Arizona Territory in 1881, painting the desert in hues of fire and shadow. Elias Kane, a man of 42, rode his dun mare along the edge of a dry wash, the reins loose in his calloused hands. His face, weathered by years of sun and loss, carried the hard lines of a man who had seen too much and spoken too little. His coat, patched and faded from its Confederate gray, hung loose on his broad frame, a relic of a war he'd survived but never left behind. A rusted canteen swung from his saddle, half empty, its metallic clink a steady rhythm against the mare's steps. Elias was a drifter now, though he hadn't always been. Once he'd owned a small spread in Texas, a place where he and his wife Clara had planned a life. But cholera took her in '74, and with her went the last tether to a settled existence. Since then he'd wandered, taking work where he could, herding cattle, mending fences, or guarding wagon trains. His life was a cycle of dust and solitude, his only company the ghosts of a past he couldn't bury. Today, he was headed toward a small trading post near the Gila River, chasing rumors of work. His pockets held just enough coin for a meal, maybe a night's rest under a roof. The wash curved toward a stand of cottonwoods, their leaves whispering in the evening breeze. Elias slowed the mare, her ears twitching at the sound of water. A shallow pool glimmered ahead, fed by a trickle from the cliffs above. He dismounted, intending to refill his canteen, when a ripple in the water stopped him cold. 3 women stood in the pool, their figures half submerged, their dark hair gleaming wet in the dying light. They were Navajo, their woven dresses discarded on the bank, the fabric faded and torn, marked by weeks of hard travel. Their skin glowed bronze under the sun's last rays, and their eyes, sharp and unyielding, locked on him. Elias froze, his hand tightening on the canteen. He'd seen trouble enough in his years to know that strangers in this land often meant danger. The Navajo had been driven from these parts, their camps burned or scattered by soldiers and settlers alike. To stumble on 3 women alone, vulnerable, was a complication he didn't need. He turned to mount up and ride away, but the tallest of the 3 stepped forward, water swirling around her waist. Her voice cut through the silence, her English rough but deliberate. "You see us here," she said, her tone carrying the weight of a command. "Now you are bound to us. You must take us as your own." The words hit Elias like a fist. He stood rooted, his mind racing. Marry them? It was absurd, a demand born of some custom he didn't understand, or maybe a trap. His life had no room for others, not for their burdens, not for their risks. Yet the women's faces held no jest, only a fierce resolve. The eldest, with a braid coiled tight and a scar tracing her cheek, stood with the authority of someone who'd led through hardship. The second, slighter, her hair loose and tangled, watched him with cautious eyes, her hands trembling faintly. The youngest, barely past 20, had a defiant spark in her gaze, her lips curling as if daring him to refuse. "I ain't marrying nobody," Elias said, his voice rough from disuse. "I'm just passing through." The eldest stepped closer, water dripping from her arms. "You saw us. Our law says you claim us or we are shamed. You leave us, we die." Elias's jaw tightened. He wanted to turn his back, to ride off and leave them to their fate. He'd spent years building walls around his grief, and 3 strangers weren't about to tear them down. But he saw the hunger in their faces, the exhaustion in their slumped shoulders, the way their dresses hung in tatters, barely holding together. They weren't here by choice. They were running, same as he was, from a world that had taken too much. He mounted the mare, his movements sharp, and rode toward the ridge where he'd planned to camp. The canteen still swung empty. He told himself they'd stay behind, that they'd find their own way. But as he crested the hill, he glanced back. The women had climbed from the pool, pulling on their worn dresses, their bare feet sinking into the sand. They followed him, silent and steady, their steps relentless as the desert itself. By the time Elias reached his camp, a small clearing, near a dry creek bed, the women were there, standing at the edge of the firelight. He cursed under his breath, tethering the mare to a mesquite tree. His camp was sparse. A bedroll, a small fire pit, a sack of beans and jerky. He didn't have enough to feed four, not for long. Yet the women sat without asking, their eyes fixed on him, waiting. "Why me?" he muttered, more to himself than to them. The eldest answered, her voice steady. "You are alone. We are alone. The world does not want us. But you see us." Her words struck deeper than he wanted. Elias had been invisible for years, a man moving through towns like a shadow. These women saw him not as a drifter, but as someone who could change their fate. He didn't want the responsibility, but he couldn't deny the pull of their shared isolation. He built a fire, the flames casting flickering shadows across their faces. The eldest introduced herself as Tsela, her name sharp and clear. The second, quieter, was Nijoni, her eyes always darting to her sisters. The youngest, with a smile that flickered like the fire, was Astza, her boldness tempered by the wear of their journey. They spoke little, but their presence filled the silence Elias had grown used to. He cooked beans, dividing the small portion into 4 tin cups. They ate quickly, their hands steady despite their hunger. Tsela watched him as she ate, her gaze measuring. Nizoni kept her eyes down, her fingers brushing the frayed hem of her dress. Astza glanced at him, her smile faint but curious, as if testing whether he'd send them away. When the fire burned low, Elias pointed to his spare blanket. "Take it," he said gruffly. "Ground's cold." Tsela nodded, spreading the blanket near the fire. The women lay close together, their breathing soft in the night. Elias sat by the dying embers, his rifle across his lap. He told himself they'd leave come morning. But as he watched them sleep, their faces softened by the firelight. He felt a stirring he hadn't known since Clara. Not desire, but something heavier, a recognition of shared loss, of lives stripped bare by the world. Morning came sharp and cold. Elias woke to the sound of Tsela breaking branches for the fire. Nijoni was folding the blanket, her movements precise. Astza crouched by the mare, stroking its muzzle, her laughter soft as the horse nudged her. They hadn't left. Instead, they moved as if they belonged, their presence weaving into the rhythm of his camp. He should have sent them away. Every practical thought screamed it, the risk of being seen with Navajo women, the whispers that would spread in town, the danger of soldiers or bounty hunters. But when Tsela handed him a cup of boiled coffee, her fingers brushing his, he felt the weight of her trust. When Nijoni offered a shy smile, her hands stained with ash from the fire, he saw her quiet resilience. When Astza laughed, pointing at a hawk circling above, he felt the cabin of his solitude crack. By midday, Elias made a choice he didn't fully understand. "If you're staying," he said, his voice low, "you work. We move tomorrow. There's a homestead a day's ride north. Needs fixing. You help, you eat." Tsela's eyes met his, steady and unreadable. "We work," she said simply. They broke camp, the women walking beside the mare, their steps sure despite their worn moccasins. Elias rode ahead, his mind a tangle of doubt and resolve. He didn't know what lay north, only that it was away from towns and soldiers. He didn't know why he let them follow, only that turning them away felt like betraying something vital in himself. The homestead came into view at dusk, a sagging cabin, a half-collapsed barn, a dry well choked with sand. It was a ruin, but it was shelter. Elias dismounted, his boots crunching on the cracked earth. The women stood behind him, their eyes scanning the place. Tsela nodded once as if claiming it. Nijoni's hands tightened on her skirt, but she stepped forward. Astza grinned, already moving toward the barn, her energy cutting through the stillness. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and rot. Elias lit a lamp, its weak light revealing cracked walls and a single table. The women set to work without being asked, Tsela sweeping, Nijoni stacking wood, Astza hauling water from a trickle nearby. Elias watched, his chest tight. He'd spent years running from connection, from anything that could break him again. Now 3 strangers had slipped past his defenses, their presence filling the hollow spaces of his life. That night, as they sat around a small fire, Tsela spoke. "You are not alone now," she said, her voice low. "Neither are we." Elias didn't answer, but her words settled deep. He looked at them, Tsela's steady resolve, Nijoni's quiet strength, Astza's defiant spark, and knew he'd crossed a line. The world outside would not forgive this choice, but for the first time in years, he didn't care. The Arizona homestead stood defiant against the creeping dawn, its sagging timbers and patched walls a testament to the labor of hands that refused to surrender. Elias Kane moved through the morning chill, his boots crunching on frost-dusted earth, the shotgun a familiar weight in his arms. The past weeks had transformed the ruin into something alive. Fences mended, the well cleared, the cabin's hearth glowing with steady warmth. Tsela, Nijoni, and Astza, the three Navajo women who had stumbled into his life, worked alongside him, their presence weaving purpose into his days. Yet the shadow of the world beyond the ridge loomed larger with each passing sunrise. Elias knew the trading post 10 miles south churned with rumors. Whispers of a drifter harboring Navajo women had grown into accusations, fueled by men who saw difference as a threat. Every trip for supplies tightened the knot in his gut. He'd caught the glares, the muttered words, squaw lover, traitor, and felt the weight of eyes tracking his movements. Tsela had seen it too, her sharp gaze catching his tension when he returned with sacks of flour and nails. Nijoni, quieter, had begun asking him small questions in halting English, as if naming the tools he used, hammer, rope, axe, could anchor her to this place. Astza, bold and restless, followed him to the corral daily, her laughter a spark against the gathering storm. The women had changed the homestead, and they had changed Elias. The cabin, once a hollow shell of grief, now hummed with life. Tsela's steady hands split kindling with precision, her scar-lined cheek a map of survival. Nijoni's soft voice filled the evenings as she mended blankets, her fingers threading hope into each stitch. Astza's defiance shone in her quick grin, her insistence on learning to handle the cattle even when they kicked dust in her face. They were no longer strangers, but Elias felt the question that hung unspoken. How long could they hold this fragile peace? He prepared them as best he could. He taught Tsela to aim his old revolver, her grip calm and unyielding. Nijoni, trembling at first, learned to load it, her hands steadying with each try. Astza, eager for action, practiced swinging a fence post like a club, her eyes daring the world to test her. They barred the cabin door at night, stacked stones along the porch for cover, and hid blankets in the barn's loft for a last retreat. Every task was a quiet vow. They would not be taken. At night they sat by the fire, the women teaching Elias Navajo words, Weashom-i for horse, Weashom-i for courage. He showed them how to bake flatbread, burning his fingers and earning Astza's teasing laughter. Tsela sat closer now, her shoulder brushing his, her eyes holding a trust that made his chest ache. Nijoni's smiles, once rare, bloomed more often, her voice soft as she spoke of her lost brother, her words a bridge between their pasts. Astza, bold as ever, nudged Elias one evening, pointing to the stars and naming them in her tongue, her joy alight against the darkness. One night, as the fire burned low, Tsela's voice cut through the quiet. You could still send us away, save your land, your name. Elias met her gaze, the weight of her words settling deep. Land's just dirt. Name's just noise. You're what matters now. Her hand found his, brief but deliberate, her calluses warm against his skin. Nijoni looked away, her cheeks flushed, but a faint smile curved her lips. Astza grinned, tossing a stick into the fire, the sparks rising like a promise. The moment felt like a vow, unspoken but binding, that they were no longer just surviving, they were building something worth fighting for. The storm broke on a cold dawn, the air sharp with the promise of winter. Elias woke to the thunder of hooves, a sound heavier than any before. He grabbed the shotgun and stepped onto the porch, his breath clouding in the chill. 12 riders crested the ridge, their rifles glinting in the pale light, dust rising like a warning. He recognized faces from the trading post, men with grudges, men who'd never fought a war but carried the cruelty of those who had. Behind him, Tsela appeared, revolver in hand, her braid tight against her neck. Najoni clutched a kitchen knife, her face pale but resolute. Azza stood at the door, her chin lifted, a rock in her fist. The leader, a man with a gray beard and a cruel mouth, reined his horse at the gate. "Cain, you've gone too far. Hiding runaways? You know what that makes you. Hand 'em over or we burn this place to ash." Elias raised the shotgun, his voice steady as stone. "They ain't runaways. They're my family. You step on my land, you'll leave in pieces." The word family hung in the air, raw and true. The riders laughed, but it was uneasy, their eyes flickering to the women behind him. Sela stood tall, her revolver gleaming. Nizoni's knife caught the light, her hands no longer trembling. Azda's rock was raised, her eyes blazing with defiance. The sight of them, unbroken and unashamed, cracked the men's confidence. The leader sneered, his hand twitching toward his pistol. "You think you can keep him?" "Ain't no law protects that." Elias stepped forward, the shotgun steady. "Law don't mean nothing out here. Only a man's will. And I'm telling you, I'll kill the first one who crosses that fence." The air thickened, horses snorting, hooves pawing the dirt. For a heartbeat the world held still. Then the leader drew, his pistol flashing. Elias fired first, the shotgun's roar splitting the dawn, the man's shoulder exploding in blood as he fell from his saddle. Chaos erupted. Shots cracked, horses screamed, dust choked the air. Sela fired the revolver, her bullet grazing a rider's arm, sending him reeling. Nijoni darted to the porch's edge, slashing a rein with her knife, forcing a horse to rear. Azza hurled her rock, striking a rider's chest, her shout in Navajo a war cry that echoed across the desert. Elias moved with the precision of a soldier, reloading and firing, driving the riders back. Sela's shots were steady, each one a warning. Nijoni, small but fierce, ducked and struck, her knife flashing. Azza grabbed a fallen rifle, firing wildly, her laughter sharp with defiance. The riders, caught off guard by the resistance, faltered. Their shots went wide, their horses panicked. Within minutes they broke, 6 fleeing into the dawn, 3 wounded, 1 dead in the dirt. Silence fell, heavy and ringing. Elias lowered the shotgun, his chest heaving, blood seeping from a graze on his thigh. He turned to the women, their faces streaked with dust and sweat. Sela dropped the revolver, her hands shaking but her eyes steady. Nijoni ran to him, tearing her skirt to bind his wound, her fingers quick and gentle. Azza laughed, tears streaming down her face, and threw her arms around her sisters. Then Elias, her grip fierce. Inside, the cabin bore the scars of battle, bullet holes in the walls, a shattered window, the air thick with gunpowder. But the fire still burned, and the women's breathing filled the space. Elias sat, his leg bandaged, and looked at them. Sela's gaze held his, a silent acknowledgement of what they'd done. Nijoni's hands trembled, but her eyes were soft with relief. Azza's grin was unbroken, her energy a spark that refused to fade. "They'll come again," Sela said, her voice calm but certain. Elias nodded. "Let 'em. We're ready." The words were more than bravado. They were a promise sealed in blood and dust. That night, as the women sat close to the fire, Elias spoke the truth he'd carried since they'd arrived. "You're home now. Not for a night, not for a season, for good. You're mine to protect and I'm yours to keep." Sela's hand found his, her grip firm. Nijoni smiled, her eyes bright with tears. Azza leaned against his shoulder, her laughter soft, a sound of triumph. The cabin, scarred but standing, was no longer a refuge, it was a home. Built not by chance but by choice. As the women slept near the fire, their breathing steady, Elias sat with the shotgun across his lap. He thought of Clara, the grief that had once consumed him, and realized it no longer held him captive. He hadn't replaced her, he'd built something new, something stronger. The questions that might have lingered, whether the town would return, whether the land could sustain them, faded beneath the certainty of what they'd forged. They were a family, bound by will, by defiance, by the shared weight of survival. The next dawn broke clear, the desert stretching wide and unbroken. Elias stepped outside, the women at his side, their hands busy with the day's work. The homestead stood scarred but alive, a testament to their stand. And as the sun rose, Elias knew the truth. No matter what came, they would face it together, not as drifter and refugees, but as a family forged in the fire of the desert, unyielding and whole.